Test 1, 2. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Frank Goza. Those lights are really bright, Rick. So, anyway, you need sunglasses if you stand over there. Anyway, my name is Frank Goza, and I'm the Dean of the College of Letters and Sciences. And anyway, we're going to have a great evening tonight, but I want to thank you all for coming out for this event. I know how cold it is and how windy, but it's my great pleasure to welcome those of you who work on this campus to the Timmerman Auditorium. I can't even see you with those lights. I apologize for that. I usually like to make eye contact, but it's not happening right now. Anyway, and welcome to those of you who do not work on this campus, who are not familiar with it, to the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. It's fantastic to see so many students, faculty, staff, and community members here tonight for this great event funded by the Tommy Thompson Center for Public Leadership. Tonight's speaker, Mr. Rick Barrett, comes to us by way of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, where he is an award-winning business writer who covers a variety of diverse topics. Tonight we are in for a treat, as Mr. Barrett will share stories with us about the intense rural-urban polarization occurring in the state of Wisconsin and across the nation. Mr. Barrett's journalism is significant because it helps bridge the rural-urban divide. His efforts to bring stories and voices of rural Wisconsinites to the state's largest newspaper informs a primarily urban audience about the specific challenges of working and living in greater Wisconsin. Beyond merely informing readers, Barrett's reporting also meets the quintessential definition of the Fourth Estate. By writing an important series of articles that together expose inequity, chronicle change, and hold policymakers accountable, Barrett's work ultimately offers important solutions to the challenges facing rural Wisconsin. Moreover, the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater is a perfect setting for this evening's event. Ours is a campus with a diverse student population from a range of backgrounds, including rural, urban, and suburban. And our community of Whitewater itself is a regional center that stands at the crossroads of agriculture and industry. I'm now very pleased to introduce Dr. Anna Thompson-Hodgdick, a lecturer of English and Film Studies on this campus. Without Dr. Hodgdick's hard work and dedication, tonight's event would not be possible. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anna Hodgdick.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Dean Goza. And so I have just a few additional remarks, particularly to acknowledge here the funding of the Tommy Thompson Center for Public Leadership that makes this event possible. As governor of Wisconsin, Tommy Thompson's goal was to bring people together to accomplish positive change. Through his masterful reporting, I know that Rick Barrett shares that goal. In his varied journalism career, he has shed light on many crucial issues, but most significantly, for the purpose of this evening, the challenges facing rural Wisconsin. His extensive 2021 series of articles, Disconnected, examined the lack of consistent rural broadband access across the state during the height of the pandemic. Barrett's coverage of the struggling dairy industry received a 2019 National Headliner Award, his second. His work also has earned a Gerald Loeb Award for Outstanding Business Reporting, a Bartlett and Steele Award for Investigative Reporting, and has been recognized by the Society of Environmental Journalists and the Association of Healthcare Journalists. He has been with the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, the state's largest newspaper, since 2000. One of the fundamental missions of the Thompson Center is to take on policy matters of the day that call out for greater leadership. When they issued a call for speakers last spring on the topic of challenges facing rural Wisconsin, I could think of no better individual than Rick Barrett to speak on this theme because of his extensive on-the-ground experiences with folks in our state that are struggling in a whole host of ways. This is truly a bipartisan issue that demands greater leadership from our politicians and our policymakers. I want to thank the Thompson Center for the funding that has made this evening possible. And so without further delay, Rick Barrett.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm right there. Okay. Okay, can you all hear me okay? Thank you very much for coming out tonight. I really appreciate this, and thank you, Anna, for that introduction. I guess what I'd like to do tonight is walk you through a couple different projects. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, we launched in 2019 and in 2020 also. First one was dairy, because it had just been on our minds for a long time. We'd seen the loss of dairy farms since around mid-2014. We had covered a fair amount of it, but it felt like it needed a little bigger picture treatment. We felt like we wanted to go deeper with it, and it launched the project for us, which I'm going to give you kind of a walk through our reporting tonight, but much more importantly, I want you to get a feel for some of the folks that we met, the farmers who are really the heart and soul of this state. Some of the most wonderful people I've ever met, hardworking, resourceful. They'll come up with solutions for just about anything, although there are some things that are just out of their control. But we wanted to really celebrate some of these farms and also look for some solutions in terms of the dairy crisis and what was going on with the loss of farms. So that got us going with the reporting project. Shortly after, we partnered with Frontline PBS and Milwaukee Public Television to do a couple of different documentaries on this. I think we did 3 altogether, but the first 2 were pretty short, and then COVID came along and just derailed everything. So we came back and we did a 3rd one, which I'll just give you a few minutes of it tonight, just for a glimpse into it, a taste of what that's about. And then we came back through COVID. Then we figured out, well, dairy is very important and we're going to continue on that path, but we were also seeing how important broadband was in rural Wisconsin. Because so many places didn't have a decent high-speed internet connection, and it was not good. So we started to look into that as part of, the project that was kind of the sequel to the dairy. Long story short, that's what 2019 and much of 2020 and a little bit of 2020 was about for me. Those were the projects that I worked on. So again, I guess I'll just start out. We'll give you a few minutes of the PBS special, because I think it kind of sets it up nicely and gets you a feel for what we were seeing out there in terms of the farms and some of the folks we met. So I'll start that here.
Well, we've got a nice sunny day shaping up here in central Wisconsin today with the bright blue sky out there today, lots of bright sunshine. Grandpa used to say this is a haymaker, so get out there and make it count today. It is time for Insight.
This is Insight. Phone lines are open. Dial 384-2191.
Good morning from AM 1450 WDLB. Mike Warren with you. We are going to be talking about a lot of issues related to the dairy industry. Past, present, future, you name it, I'm sure we'll cover it all. Rick Barrett is a business reporter for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel.
Thank you, Mike. We really appreciate you having us here.
So you have covered agriculture for how long?
For about 20 years in Wisconsin.
This has not been an easy time. We keep losing farm after farm after farm here in Wisconsin.
It's been an incredibly difficult time. Well, come on, bud.
This is where I spent most of my time. 230 cows used to roam in here every day.
Yeah. How did you make the decision to say, I'm done?
That was Dad's decision. I would have rather kept going, even though I knew things weren't going well.
Yeah.
And I was upset.
Okay.
Matter of fact, I probably said a few choice words. that I shouldn't have, but
when my parents, when they were farming, if you needed more money, you worked harder. I can work harder until I'm blue in the face, and it ain't gonna help nothing.
Oops, I'm sorry. I don't know what I'm doing.
Farming, if you needed more money, you worked harder. I can work harder until I'm blue in the face, and it ain't gonna help nothing.
Everything is always evolving. So you gotta, you can't be afraid of change. And things are gonna change. They always have, they always will.
Dairy industry, you can produce as much milk as you want, more and more and more every day, more every day. But if there's nowhere to go with that, we all know how supply and demand works.
10, 50, 10, quarter, 10, half, 50, 10, a quarter, 10, a half, sold, 10, and a quarter. When I'm on the block selling and you see a grown dad crying in the stands as you're selling his cows, that's not an easy day for them or for the auction staff. I've always been optimistic. I love dairy farming, and I like being out in the country. I like crops, I like cattle, I like the lifestyle.
He's willing to change with the times. He wants to try new things, which is not easy for a lot of farmers.
If you want to survive in the future, you have to have a beginner's mind. The farm is going to continue to exist in the future. It's just going to look slightly different.
Farmers, they just nose to the grindstone type of people, and they always figure out a way, don't they?
well, we hope so.
Okay. Okay, can you still hear me okay? That's just a few minutes, the intro to the documentary. I guess I'd like to pick up from there, if I may please, with some of the farmers we met in our reporting. And it was primarily in Clark County because when you look at the state, Clark County still has more dairy farms than any other county. And most of them are small and mid-sized farms, and there are actually nearly twice as many cows as people in Clark County. So it's a very rural county, and it's dairy and farming is the economic engine there. In towns like Loyal, I mean, that's the hub, and it's surrounded by farms that are so important to that area. So we spent quite a bit of time on Clark County, but we're also in the northwest part of the state, and we spent a little time in southern Wisconsin as well. So we got a little bit of a mix, but I'll just get you introduced to some of the farmers we met and tell you a little bit more about them as we go. I may need to switch to the PowerPoint. There we go. Okay, there we go. Okay, in the spring of 2019, dairy farmers Chuck and Sue Spalding were milking about 60 cows on their 300-acre farm that Chuck bought when he was only a teenager. 7 years earlier, they'd borrowed heavily to modernize their barn and position things for the future. It looked good on paper, Sue said. But in late 2014, farm milk prices started to plummet. The downturn, fueled by overproduction and failing export markets, lasted more than 4 years and decimated dairy farms from Maine to California. The price farmers received for their milk fell nearly 40%. Nearly every dollar the Spaldings earned from their milk went toward their debts in farm insurance. Just kind of clicking through these quickly here, but they would get checks like this. After the deductions were taken out, the checks would come imprinted void. So, except for the little income that Chuck had from his Social Security, and they sold some hay and livestock, they were really struggling. In fact, it's been such a struggle just to keep things going, Sue said. We have managed, but now it's getting hard to pay even our basic everyday bills. I don't know how much longer we can do this. And they were working with a lot of older farm machinery, and they were keeping things put together the best that they could. But it was really a struggle. Wisconsin lost 503 dairy farms in 2017 and 691 farms in 2018. By May of 2019, around the time this photo was taken at a farm auction, the state was losing around 2.5 dairy farms a day. In 2018, for the third straight year, Wisconsin led the nation in farm bankruptcies. Most of them family dairy operations, which had been a staple of Wisconsin life for generations. One of those farms pushed out of business was owned by Emily and Brandy Harris. We met them on a cold spring day in 2019. As one by one, they removed the leather collars from their Jersey dairy cows as the final round of milking took place on their farm. Outside the century-old barn, the wind picked up and rain started to come down. It was a fitting backdrop for the end of yet another Wisconsin dairy operation. Emily here, one last look at her cows before they left the farm. And she was loading up even the little ones at that point. At one point, Emily said the farm was profitable. They had won various awards. They were organic dairy farmers. They had a really good price on their milk at one time. But what happened was, under a new contract that they had for the milk, their price dropped by about a third. And with no other buyers to be found, the farm was losing money every day it remained in dairy. And the scenario repeated across the state. It was no longer a matter of how Emily and Brandy's farm would endure another year of financial hardship, but rather it was how they would exit the business quickly and with the least pain and financial loss. We found, sadly, quite a few examples where calves were basically brought to auction. No one wanted them. They were given away, if anyone would even take them. They had no value for a while. And you would see things like this, which were really heartbreaking. And then, one of the next things we came across was in March 2021, there was a lot of milk dumping going on. We hadn't seen that in Wisconsin for a long time. But at this particular farm, on a Tuesday night, Golden E Dairy got the call that any farmer would dread. They were being asked to dump 25,000 gallons of fresh milk a day because there was no place for it to go in the marketplace for dairy products that was gutted by COVID. The closure of restaurants, schools, hotels, and food service businesses had taken a heavy toll on their business. An hour later, the family-run farm near West Bend opened the spigot and started flushing its milk into a wastewater lagoon. 220,000 pounds a day for nearly a week. It was surreal, Ryan Elby, whose parents, Chris and Tracy Elby, started the farm in 1991 with about 80 cows and grew it into an operation that was milking around 2,400. We never thought this would happen, he said. Everybody's rushing to the grocery store to get food, and here we have food that's literally being dumped down the drain. Suppose you get an unsigned letter. It looks like junk mail, but the message is that in 30 days, your livelihood, your home, and your family's legacy are in great peril. That's what happened to about 75 Wisconsin dairy farmers in April 2017 when they learned their milk buyer was dropping them effective May 1st. These farms couldn't just stop milking the cows. It was 3 times a day, 365 days a year, regardless of whether there was a buyer for what they produced. So when that letter came in the mailbox, informing farmers that Grassland Dairy Products would no longer buy their milk, a lot of folks were badly shaken. The company, based in Greenwood, said it was dropping the farms because it lost millions of dollars in business in a trade dispute with Canada. This difficult but necessary announcement is very hard for us as a company, and we will do our best to work with you through this transition, Grassland said in the letter to the farmers. It came as a shock to farms like this one, run by the Sauer family in Waterloo. You ask yourself, why is this happening? They definitely put the fear into us, said Jennifer Sauer. Much of the blame for the loss of dairy farms from 2014 through 2019 was placed on collapsed milk prices fueled by runaway production and trade wars that soured export markets. But another factor was intractable. Milk wasn't as popular as it used to be. As diets changed, milk faced a tidal wave of new competitors. Beverage companies had flooded the market with sports drinks, energy drinks, plant-based sodas, fruit juices, and designer coffees. A typical snack bar today might carry watermelon antioxidant infusion alongside mango and hibiscus herbal tea. Please don't ask me what those are. I have no idea. But just in the last decade, the average grocery store has added nearly 600 new beverage options to its coolers and shelves. Compared with the loss of small and mid-sized farms, large-scale dairy farming was on a different trajectory. They'd grown rapidly and had taken over an increasing share of the state's milk production. Some house thousands of cows in massive metal buildings. Cows are milked 3 times a day in an operation that runs around the clock. Some of the buildings run the length of a half a dozen football fields. Farmers have been known to fly drones inside to get a bird's eye view of their operations. And there's another source of revenue for some of the largest farms. In fact, they produce as much organic waste as a city the size of Fond du Lac or Madison. And it's a new source of revenue and a way to control some of the methane to keep the environment cleaner. And it's anaerobic methane digesters that convert manure gas into fuel used to run vehicles like buses and trucks. The digesters have become a profitable sideline for farms seeking additional ways to use millions of gallons of manure. Wisconsin has more than 300 methane digesters, including around 50 on dairy farms, according to the State Public Service Commission. Most are at wastewater treatment plants, landfills, food manufacturers, and industrial sites. Earlier this year, one of the biggest units in the nation was under construction in Greenleaf, about 18 miles southwest of Green Bay. And that's where we shot these photos, was that operation. That when it was finished, it was expected to process more than 360 million gallons of manure a year from 11 farms with a total of around 25,000 cows. Those who run big farms, let me back up for a minute. Those who run the big farms say it's for a good reason. Through economies of scale, they have lower operating costs, and they produce a lot more milk. Most of the large Wisconsin dairy farms are family-owned, although there are outside investors in some operations. Scaling back the size isn't the answer, they say, as dairy, like every other business, needs to remain profitable. Sometimes decisions to expand are made for reasons other than supply and demand. For example, a child coming home from college wanting to buy into the farm, or siblings and cousins merging smaller dairy farms into one large operation where they manage the business and hire help for the manual labor. Farming comes with many physical risks, including some that are unexpected. In Clark County, we met dairy farmer Roger Reith, who contracted an illness from mold that left his lungs vulnerable to COVID-19. When we met with the Reiths last year during the pandemic, they were running a 250 cow operation that had been in the family since the 1940s. They were near Loyal in Clark County. So again, Clark County, it's that magical place for so many of these small farms. It's the perfect pasture. It's the right amount of rainfall. It's the climate. It's the temperature. It's everything that's just made Wisconsin dairyland. It's such a wonderful place for so many small farms. Niggin View Dairy is one of those farms. Marty Niggin, shown here with his daughter Kristen, has been milking cows since he was 15. The Niggins are well known by folks who buy their pumpkins, sweet corn, maple syrup, and mulch. The side businesses are a way of supplementing the farm's income when commodity prices are down. It's their maple syrup operation, which they have going. They do it all themselves right there on the farm. In September 2019, the Niggin farm was heavily damaged by a tornado. Neighbors immediately rallied to help clean up the mess and keep the milking operation going. In a meeting involving the entire family, including the adult children living out of state, the decision was made to rebuild. Kristen recently graduated from UW River Falls with a bachelor's degree in dairy science. She worked for an equipment company in Durand for a while and then returned home to the family farm, a decision which greatly pleased her dad. But one thing seems certain. The small farm from 10 years ago won't be around in another decade if it doesn't keep evolving. Many farms milking between 50 and 100 cows are at risk of shutting down because they don't benefit from economies of scale or they can't find hired help. When you look at the dairy industry, I don't think small farmers have a lot of hope, said Max Malm, whose family has a 120 cow operation in Clark County. And this is Max, where we had met him on his farm. He had already gone to a robotic milking system and was doing everything he could to keep it modernized. But that lack of hired help was a big deal because farms his size were having such a difficult time getting the help they needed, especially when the larger farms paid a lot more, and he just couldn't get the help that he needed. Last summer, Rail Acres, a Clark County dairy farm run by Dennis and Susie Rail, hosted Farm Technology Days, one of the largest agricultural shows in the nation. I've always wanted to do this, Dennis Rail said, adding that he first went to the show, then called Wisconsin Farm Progress Days, with his father Lowell in 1983. I thought it was the greatest thing ever, Dennis recalled. Rail Acres is another robotic dairy farm. They got the robots put in right around Farm Technology Days, and it's a really, really impressive operation. Their children is, what they're hoping that they'll go into the farm in the future, that they'll keep it going. But that's hard to say. Dennis has a degree in engineering, and I know he came back to the farm because he just loved farming. It's what he wanted to do. The children, in our conversations with them when we were doing the documentary, they were kind of hot and cold on the idea. It just depends. They're very young. So they were trying to figure it out themselves, but one of the things that they did, which was kind of cool, the kids would get a time card for the work that they did on the farm, for their chores. And, they were learning a great work ethic. They were kind of, doing their thing, and their parents were recognizing it, just like they would someone they hired, and it was kind of neat to see that the kids were learning this amazing work ethic side by side with their parents. It was pretty cool. At first glance, milk may seem an unlikely example of the globalization of agriculture. But although it's highly perishable if not refrigerated within a few hours, it has a shelf life of years when processed into powder that easily flows across borders. In fact, Wisconsin exported $3.96 billion in agricultural and food products to 146 products in 2021, including around $249 million in dairy. Part of our reporting looked at dairy farming in Canada, Mexico, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand. We wanted to see where Wisconsin dairy products were going, how the rest of the world was doing dairy, and how some of the challenges compared in other places. In Canada, Norm McNaughton's fifth-generation dairy farm sits on the edge of London, Ontario. It's surrounded by freshly built homes, condos, and golf courses. It sports a new barn and a robotic milking system. His cows milk themselves when they feel like it. One at a time, they stroll up to the milking station, they nudge the gate open, and they step inside. A robotic arm swings down, sanitizes each teat, and then attaches laser-guided suction cups to extract the milk. The cow munches on a snack dispensed by the machine as an incentive to cooperate. If something goes wrong, McNaughton gets an alert on his smartphone, Sometimes he can solve the problem by sending commands over his phone. He can also tap into a live video stream and see whether it's serious enough to drop what he's doing and head to the barn. One of the things he told us was, you know, the cows would like to mess with the robot. They were always trying to get that second treat. And so they would do, you know, they would try to trick the machine into doing that. And then he would get an alert on his phone when he was away from the farm saying, you know, the machine's jammed up, there's something wrong. So he could tap into the video stream and he would see the cow in there and she was doing her thing, trying to get the extra treat. And I think at one point he actually said that he could use audio over it and he could actually reach out and, you know, yell at the cow to get out of there. It was kind of cool because the cows aren't really smart, and if they can figure out a way to get a second treat, they'll do it. But they learned this system so quickly. He went from, you know, traditional milking to this robot system, and he said they just picked it up right away. It was amazing how quickly they figured it out. And it's worked out really well for him. The robot's manufacturer is in Germany, and they can also look in and see what's happening. And it's got an emergency stop, so if something goes wrong, they can shut it down quickly. He has a robotic feeder that runs up and down the barn aisles, dispensing just the right amount of rations. The farm's technology is a luxury born of confidence in the future. Around half of the new farms built in Canada have robots, reducing the need for hired help and lessening the workload on farm families. We like being in the barn, McNaughton says. We just don't like milking the cows. The success, he says, is a tribute to Canada's milk supply management system. Under it, the amount of milk that farmers produce is limited to keep the supply in line with consumer demand. Milk prices are set to cover production costs and provide farmers with a nice profit. Our system isn't perfect, but it does have stability, McNaughton says. And these two farms, well, this farm that was not too far away from the McNaughtons, much smaller, very traditional in milking, but what they had done was they had a local milk bottling plant in their community that's where their milk went to, and it was literally the glass milk bottles that went to door, and it was really nice. They had a really sweet operation. It was enough, even though it wasn't a lot of milk production under Canada's system, because the price was really pretty good and their costs were low enough, they could do well, just with a small herd and this local milk bottling plant. It was kind of cool to see. Not far from the McNaughton farm, Toon and Sylvia De Beer left their native Holland to start farming careers in Canada. We met them in 2019 while they were milking 480 cows. They'd built this new barn and milking parlor less than 2 years earlier. It's a showcase operation. I mean, the outside of the building, it looks almost like an office building, and it's inside is, they have conference rooms that overlook the milking parlor, and they have these beautiful granite floors with the name on the grates. It's just a really classy looking place. And they're milking on a rotary carousel parlor. It's just state of the art. It's not robots, but it's really, it's very efficient for a farm. Next, we went to Mexico. There we found fewer big farms And the landscape varied widely depending on where we were in the country, but a lot of it was very arid, and cattle feed was expensive. Farmers had to buy a lot of their own. We met this guy, and let me just pick up here one moment. This was Jose Munoz. Remember? And he was a third generation dairy farmer. He was getting by okay, but his children did not want to go into the business. So he was probably going to be the last generation. He didn't feel like the dairy farms in Mexico, at least the ones of his size, had too much of a future. In Mexico, the dairy farmers complained that their country was flooded with cheap dairy products from the western US, and that it was difficult for them to compete. Some of the farms in Mexico that we visited had their own cheese operations, which were really cool. They would provide cheese for the local markets, and they captured that revenue. So even though they wouldn't have gotten much for their milk, if they could manufacture the cheese, they did okay. It was better. There was a time when Mexico was more protective of its dairy farmers. And what we found here was from basically a heavily touted experiment in the 1970s. It was just north of Mexico City, and it was an agricultural business complex. And what they did was they tried to get a lot of these small farms and consolidate them into what was essentially an industrial park. And there they had like a processing plant, and they had a small cheese factory. The cattle feed all had to be brought in from quite a ways away. So it was so expensive. There were all kinds of issues with it. The experiment worked for quite a while, but it was under government control and subsidies. And then when the government pulled out that and it sold the processing plant, it started to come apart. And we saw the last of this kind of big, it wasn't really big at this when we saw it, but I've described it as an urban dairy farm. It was like behind a gated community almost. And it was right just north of Mexico City in a heavily urban area. So it was still in existence, but a lot of the small farms had failed. They didn't have the land to grow their own corn. The milk prices were losing ground, and it just became incredibly impractical to keep it going. But still, some of them were there. I mean, they were trudging along on their farms in this industrial park. And there was a housing complex there too, which was really kind of nice. I mean, the apartments were inside this gated community, and most of them were probably empty, but there were still some farm families living there. And it was, the kids, I don't think they had a school there, but they played on the farm just kind of like kids would here, but it was in the middle of a city. It was just so different. Let me back up for a second, because one of the things I wanted to talk about here was this industrial park dairy farm operation. Things were pretty rough when we were there. They would have their electricity shut off from time to time. And what they would do is the farmers would get together and they would protest in the streets. And they would protest loudly in the city until the electric was turned back on. And it would be back on for a while, and then they'd shut it off again. And then they would protest and it would come back on and then it would go off again. It was kind of crazy. I mean, these farms were just hanging on by a thread at this place. From Mexico, we went to Vietnam. And the focus of the dairy industry there was on building mega-size operations, even much bigger than anything you'd find here in the US. You would find some of these operations with, 40,000 cows. They were just massive buildings all strung together over hundreds of acres. And it was in such an unusual place. I mean, this operation we saw was about 150 miles south of Hanoi. And it was right along it was in the tropical landscape near the north central coast. And it was so surreal for me, having come from Wisconsin, to be in 120 degree heat. It was just sweltering hot there when we were there, hotter than I think it had been in a long time. So they would have sprinkler systems and all kinds of ways to help keep the cows cool, but they were just packed in these metal barns and it was intense. I mean, the heat was so, like nothing I'd ever experienced. I nearly passed out in it. It was so hot. People there were telling me that it was hotter than they'd ever seen. This is, I think, was one of their milking parlors. I'm sorry. Okay, I'll go faster. This is one of their milking parlors, so you can see a just massive operation. This was their feed mill that they had, and this one, if I remember right, produced about 500,000 tons of cattle feed a year. And some of the work that was done here, it was like an enormous industrial complex. State-of-the-art, modern equipment, some of it from Wisconsin, a lot of it from New Zealand, where they got their technology from. There was an emphasis there on hiring locally and promoting women into some pretty high skilled positions in management. Everything from veterinarians, herd managers and such. And then it was also kind of a mix of old Asian culture and modern technology. Here, they would glue balls of mugwort, which is a medicinal herb, to acupressure points on the cow's backs. They light the mugwort on fire to release its properties, aimed at increasing fertility. Cows didn't even flinch. They were used to this. Again, it's an old culture and new technology, and we're always struck by that. They have their own milk processing plants right on the farm, their own dairy stores. Vietnam is a country where the median age is around 30, so there's a very young population. And I'm going a little faster here because I know we're running out of time, but the next place we went to was in Thailand, and that's where you would see farmers come to like a local milk depot on their motor scooters, and they bring in these 13-gallon cans to be processed. The milk would go from here to a very large processing plant that was run by the government, and it would bring in the milk from all over the country. This was a farm that had kind of a Wild West theme to it in Thailand, and it was a tourist attraction. But it was also about a 400 cow dairy as well. School kids would come there, kind of like what they do. I mean, everywhere. Kids love to see cows. Tourist attraction for dairy was kind of a new thing in a lot of parts of Vietnam and Cambodia and Thailand. It was catching on, getting stronger. And they always told us, you know, it's farmers like this guy who they really wanted to support, a young, progressive dairy farmer, just trying to build the dairy industry in the country. Then we went to Cambodia, where they literally had one commercial dairy farm, and it was just outside Phnom Penh, one of the largest cities, the city of, I can't remember how many millions of people, but it's huge. And it was Moo Moo Farms, and they had a drive-up milk place where you could buy, you know, whatever you wanted right there. It was run by a missionary. He was a Mormon missionary that came there and knew nothing about dairy farming, but thought that the country really needed it. So he started this small farm in Cambodia. He didn't have a clue as to what he was doing, but he figured it out. He got help from the US, he got help from New Zealand, imported the cows, got it going. But this was like Phnom Penh, which is a huge city, so many young people, and that's the market that he was trying to reach with his dairy operation. While we were there, we found like Sargento string cheese, the Hoffman cheese we found from Wisconsin. It was in the stores there. It was a real premium product. I mean, people could buy the local cheese and dairy products, but Wisconsin cheese was considered, you know, one of the best. So that's, I think, am I running out of time, Anna? I'm sorry.
It's okay. I think maybe at this point, if folks have questions they would like to ask Rick about his reporting, and there are microphones right back here. There's a microphone.
I'm sorry I went on so long. I didn't time this very well, and I apologize. Yes, please. Oh, how are you?
I think if you want to go to the mic because it's being live streamed, so. Or you can use it.
Hello? Oh, okay.
Yeah, sure.
I was just a little curious, like, what got you so into, like, the Wisconsin dairy industry?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I had been an agriculture reporter at the Wisconsin State Journal. In fact, I was the last full-time ag reporter at the State Journal that had one for many, many years. And when I left, I was kind of the end of the line. Moved to Milwaukee, got into business reporting. I did cover manufacturing and telecom, and for a while I covered airlines and all sorts of things. But I really love farming, and I just kind of wanted to get back to it. So I sort of made it my mission to kind of pick up where I was and cover dairy.
You said you were a journalist for over 20 years, and I was just curious as to how that was, considering, like, in our society now, it's like we're jumping from one job to the next, not staying very long, not dwelling on it very long.
Yeah, it's a difficult time now. There's so much uncertainty about the business, and I purposely moved from place to place. I worked in Michigan, and then I worked in Texas, and then I worked in Arkansas, and I came back to Michigan. I worked in Florida, I worked in Kentucky. Part of it was because I just wanted to see the country. I just enjoyed moving around and learning new things. But I've been in Wisconsin now for 24 years, considering my time at the State Journal, and I love it here. I mean, I don't plan on going anywhere else.
Hello, my name is Rory. I'm with the Royal Purple. So I was just wondering, what would you recommend supporting farms and how would you recommend supporting the dairy industry? Whether you're a regular citizen or a journalist, how would you use that position to influence that?
It's a really good question. I think we all have a responsibility to do everything we can. I mean, it can start with just buying dairy products. Just, support your farming community. Get a chance to meet farmers, do it. I mean, for me as a journalist, that's the true pleasure. I just love farmers, I really do. I mean, they're some of the coolest people I've ever met. And I would encourage folks who live in the city, if they're concerned about the future of the dairy industry in Wisconsin, go out and visit a farmer. They'd love to have you come by, and talk with them yourself and just get to know them. If you can find local dairy products, that's really cool. That come from farms because more of the money goes in their pockets that way. But yeah, support them any way you can.
One downside of large-scale chicken farms is have more and more disease-resistant or bacteria-resistant chickens. And I was wondering if so much of this was about going large. I wonder if they have that same problem with cows.
It's a really good question. I don't think we've seen it like we have in poultry and we have in the pork industry. But I know farmers like on the large operations are very, very conscious of people coming on and off the property for that reason. There's a lot of controls that are in place, so I think it is an important deal to them. They don't want to become the next poultry industry with outbreaks of diseases and things. They're pretty good about it, I think.
On the Vietnam giant dairy, was that a private or was that a governmentally owned dairy?
That's a really good question. In Vietnam, there's a fine line between what's owned by the government and what's private. And in this case, it was an Israeli company that came in and set up the farm, and it's called TH Milk. And they were, if I understand it right, they were still the owners and managers of the farm, but the government had a lot to say in terms of the cost of the land and in terms of where the milk went and how it was sold and everything else. It was both. I mean, the government there was pretty adamant about building a dairy industry, and they contributed a lot to it.
Sounds like a kibbutz in Vietnam.
Yeah, there was a little bit of that.
The question I ask you might be too impressionist or subjective for you to know, but it did seem that what you were saying about a number of the young people on the farms here in the U.S., and it was even in Mexico too, setting up a strong vibe of not wanting that to be their future. And I didn't sense that in what you were talking about with Vietnam. It kind of got the sense there that they still see a lot of population being open to a whole life of farming. And I think what I've seen here, and even I had a friend who was raised on a farm north of Milwaukee. His dad was an auto mechanic and a farmer. Then he came here to Whitewater, then he gets a degree in art and teaches at Edgewood, and then his sister, who didn't marry, is the one who stayed alone on the farm. So the farm is going to be sold, when she passes away. I just see that so often here in the U.S., the feeling that nobody's going into farming. Or
I hope you're wrong.
Match up with
I think in many cases you're right, but I'm so hoping that we're both wrong on that. I'm hoping that there are enough young people that are going to step up and keep these farms going. Vietnam was so different. I mean, you had these enormous industrial farms, and they were owned by corporations, and there was no local ownership at all. I mean, they would hire a lot of people. They had over 1,000 employees that worked at this one farm. And so they provided jobs, but there was no pathway to ownership at all for them. It's a big difference. Yeah. Sure.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you, Rick, for joining us here tonight. I found your presentation very disturbing in terms of the high attrition rate for dairies and small dairies in general. And it sounds like the three ways that small dairies could adapt and stay in business are to diversify their products, to buy robots, or to move to Canada. So I guess I'm just wondering what you see. Are there other options out there? How else can we maintain small dairies as a key part of our culture?
I think it's going to take a combination of things. It's going to take the diversification, which you just brought up, in terms of having more than one product other than milk. It's going to take, frankly, probably one person on the farm having an off-farm income. A lot of times it's just for the insurance or for the paycheck. It's going to take higher milk prices for longer periods of time, and they're going to have low amounts of debt in order to keep going, because it's a tough business. It really is. I think a lot of the smaller farms can do it, especially if their costs are low enough. They can still make it, but it's hard.
I just, even especially with Canada, it seemed to me that there is governmental involvement of some sort, and it also seems to me by other examples that it's really not very possible to succeed without some governmental support and programs and subsidies and so on. And that's why Canada looks so attractive as far as dairy industry at this point. So what is the US doing, if anything, to help small farmers in Wisconsin and elsewhere?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, our federal dairy policy is complicated, to put it simply. I mean, it's very, very difficult for farmers to figure out what price they're going to get paid for their milk and how that price is figured. Federal dairy policy, I think, has helped some ways. There's insurance programs that help in terms of protecting farm income a little bit. But we're not Canada. We don't have a system like they have. We're free market driven. It's like night and day. It's so different.
Okay, well, we are 1 minute away from the live streaming folks having to head home. So thank you all. And Rick, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you all so much, many of you, for attending today. For my students, if you have somebody knows where that clipboard is, if you could pass it forward here. And if for those folks that haven't signed in, do make sure you do that. And again, Rick, thank you so much. Thank you so much to our folks from the Thompson Center. And thank you all for coming out on a cold October evening.